And the end result of the fall is that the world, God's perfect order, has been misdirected. And that's why we have evil. And that's why we have pain and suffering and things that go wrong in this world. Now, the interesting thing about the fall is it stretches all the way from Genesis chapter 3 to Revelation chapter 20, almost the whole length of the Bible, with 2 chapters at the beginning and 2 chapters at the end that don't have to do with the fall. Now, the third plot movement, redemption, also stretches from Genesis chapter 3 to Revelation chapter 20. So fall and redemption are always happening at the same time. And in redemption, God promises to make the things right that have gone wrong. He promises in regard to the individual that I will forgive you of your sin, and I will erase your shame, and I will make your relationship right. And he sent his son Jesus to accomplish that for us, that type of salvation for us. He also promises to the individual that if you will orient your life toward me through Christ, I will also teach you how to redirect and reorder your cultural activities so that when you operate in the arts or in the sciences or education or in church or in marriage and family or politics and economics or scholarship and education, in any of these cultural spheres, if you're living according to God's order, then you can redirect that which has been misdirected.
We see what's wrong with culture and we want to cooperate with God to make things right. Of course we do. The world isn't the way God wants it to be. But what is a Christian's role in making cultural change? What is a Christian's role in a polarized political society? Does the gospel of Jesus Christ inform us of any of this? Dr. Bruce Ashford is an author, speaker, and columnist. He wrote or co-wrote 9 books, including Every Square Inch, An Introduction to Cultural Engagement for Christians, The Gospel of Our King, Bible, Worldview, and the Mission of Every Christian, and his latest, The Doctrine of Creation, A Constructive Kuyperian Approach. He is a senior research fellow at the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology in Cambridge, England. Well, welcome to the Reintegrate podcast, Bruce. We really appreciate you coming.
Bob, thank you. And Brendan, thank you. Very happy to be on the podcast.
Could you tell us about your journey into getting your degrees and teaching at a seminary and what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I went to college at Campbell University here in North Carolina, double majoring in government and journalism, and thought that I would probably take a career either in law with an eye toward becoming a judge or in politics. But as it turns out, the Lord gave me a desire to be in full-time professional ministry. So I went to seminary, did a master's degree, ended up living in Russia for 2 years and lived in the city of Kazan, which is about half Muslim and about half atheist and or Christian. And that was quite the experience for me. While I was there, was offered a job teaching philosophy at Moscow State University, contingent upon me completing a PhD in philosophy. So I came back to the States and completed a PhD, wrote my dissertation on a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. That's a mouthful. And as it happens, Vladimir Putin was elected president just as I was in the middle of my PhD. And the dean, assistant dean there, contacted me and said, well, President Putin is a nationalist, to put it lightly. You're an American and you're an evangelical. And so that's 2 strikes and you're out here in Russia. So I didn't get that job, but I was hired here. And over time, so I taught philosophy and theology. And then over time, my interest gravitated very much towards social, cultural, and political analysis, and had an opportunity to be a regular columnist for a national news agency on political matters, published a number of books, 8 or 9 books, 2 of which were directly on political topics and 2 of which were directly on more broadly cultural topics. Eventually, I resigned as professor, and now I'm a full-time writer and speaker, with my calling being taking the Christian faith and integrating it with the different spheres of culture: art, science, politics, education, sports and competition, marriage and family, and so forth. And now I'm associated with the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology, on the campus of Cambridge University in England, but I work from here in the United States.
Well, that's why we wanted you on Reintegrate, because we're trying to reintegrate the Christian faith with all those different spheres that you're talking about.
So, Bruce, I'd be interested to hear your opinion on what the biblical foundations are for understanding a Christian's role in culture and public life.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the Bible, when I was growing up, my parents gave me a great legacy, which is to love Scripture and study it. But as we study Scripture, we realize that God didn't give us a systematic theology text in the Bible. And he didn't give us a textbook on cultural analysis or social analysis or political analysis. But what he did do is he gave us 66 books written by numerous authors in multiple genres that cohere around a central storyline of God interacting with his people. And I think the reason God did it that way, a couple of reasons, is if you have a personal God, who interacts with the world he created, you automatically have a story. It's a story of God interacting with his people. And a second reason is that God made us human beings to be the kind of beings who learn from stories and remember stories. We remember stories a lot better than we do arguments or systematic treatises. Anyone can remember a story. A child can remember a story. And so the Bible has one central storyline, and there's different ways of dividing that storyline. And the way that I'll do it right now is to divide it into 4 plot movements: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. There's a way of expanding that into 5 or 6 plot movements and going into a little more detail, but for now we'll do 4. First plot movement is creation. And we learn from the scriptures, not just from the Genesis account, but the entire Bible, that God created the world with a certain order to it. And there's an order to the universe, laws of physics. And there's a moral order, right? Things that are right and things that are wrong. There's a cultural order that God created different kinds of culture, art, science, politics, for example. And that each kind of culture has a unique reason for being. It exists for a reason. And also, each of those spheres of culture, we could call them, because it's a spatial analogy, a sphere. If it has a center, a reason for being, it also has a circumference, right? And so, because each has a unique reason for being, each sphere of culture also has limits to its jurisdiction, right? So if the arts exist to produce beauty or to show the difference between beauty and ugliness and light and darkness and that kind of thing, then the arts don't exist to govern a nation. That's why government and politics exist. And if government and politics exist to govern a nation, to achieve justice among the various individuals and communities under its purview, then it's not supposed to tell churches who can be a pastor and who can't. That's the job of churches. So each sphere of culture has its own unique reason for being. And so that's how God created the world. And at the time he created it, it ran perfectly. Everything was well ordered. There was no disorder. There was no corruption. And the world was ordered so that every human being worshiped God. And the overflow of that worship, you saw that in a person's moral life. You saw that in how a person would interact in the different spheres of culture. But the second plot movement is the fall. And this is a very dark plot movement in the storyline. It's the only dark plot movement. And that is when human beings decided to break with God's order. And when Satan used a serpent as his mouthpiece to tempt them to worship anything other than God. And so Adam and Eve did that. And so have all of us. They decided that they would make gods of themselves and decide on their own what is right and what is wrong. And when that happened, and it happened with them and it happens with all of us, our hearts are directed. So the Bible teaches that every human heart is religious. It worships. And if you want to find someone's religion, look for their God. And if you want to find someone's God, look for whatever they've made ultimate in their life. We all ascribe ultimacy to something. We all absolutize something, either the God of Jesus Christ or something else. And if we choose something else and order our lives toward that, then our lives are misdirected. They're not properly directed toward God. And if that's the case, then everything we do, our cultural activities, are misdirected. They point away from God instead of toward God. And the end result of the fall is that the world, God's perfect order, has been misdirected. And that's why we have evil. And that's why we have pain and suffering and things that go wrong in this world. Now, the interesting thing about the fall is it stretches all the way from Genesis chapter 3 to Revelation chapter 20, almost the whole length of the Bible, with 2 chapters at the beginning and 2 chapters at the end that don't have to do with the fall. Now, the third plot movement, redemption, also stretches from Genesis chapter 3 to Revelation chapter 20. So fall and redemption are always happening at the same time. And in redemption, God promises to make the things right that have gone wrong. He promises in regard to the individual that I will forgive you of your sin, and I will erase your shame, and I will make your relationship right. And he sent his son Jesus to accomplish that for us, that type of salvation for us. He also promises to the individual that if you will orient your life toward me through Christ, I will also teach you how to redirect and reorder your cultural activities so that when you operate in the arts or in the sciences or education or in church or in marriage and family or politics and economics or scholarship and education, in any of these cultural spheres, if you're living according to God's order, according to his moral law and natural, the laws of nature and that sort of thing, then you can redirect that which has been misdirected. In other words, instead of directing your activities toward some false God, direct it toward the one true and living God. Now, the plot movement of redemption is in its initial stages and hasn't been consummated. I mean, our salvation has been complete with the cross and the resurrection, and yet there's still things wrong with this world, right? We still see rape and murder and injustice of various different types. We see our cultural institutions misdirected toward idols and flawed and corrupt, and we see injustice everywhere. And so the fourth plot movement, that we could call restoration, is really a continuation of redemption. It's the consummation, the completion of God's redemption, that he will send Christ Jesus back one day. And when he returns as the King of the universe that he is, justice will roll down like the waters. Injustice will disappear. Sin will disappear. Evil, pain, suffering, tears, all of these things will disappear. And the picture that we're given of this restoration is that God will take this heavens and earth on which we live, and he will make it right. So God is not going to make all new things. He's not going to create a new world. He's going to make all things new. He's going to take what he already created, and he's going to make it right. He's going to erase it of sin, or erase sin's consequences. He's going to redirect everything that's been misdirected. He's going to heal everything that's been corrupted. And so we're going to live a very cultural life on this new heavens and earth. It's going to have all the same cultural spheres. I mean, the Bible shows us art and architecture and song. I mean, the Bible tells us that human cultural creations are going to make it into the new heavens and earth. We're told that the ships of Tarshish will be on the new heavens and earth. We're told that the cedars of Lebanon will be on the new heavens and new earth. The prophets said that there's going to be an enormous city, the New Jerusalem. So architecture, there's going to be song. And so this is what we have to look forward to, that we get to live our lives out individually and corporately, socially and culturally, in a way that is rightly and perfectly ordered toward God. This is the Christian hope. And by hope, we don't mean we think this is probably going to happen. We really hope it does. We mean something more certain than that. Our hope is in the fact that this will happen.
The way the world is, broken, sinful, this isn't God's original intention. This isn't the first 2 chapters. Most people who don't know this 4-chapter story, they just assume it's always been this way. Something's wrong with God, therefore, if there is a God, that everything's broken this way, and people sin and people murder and people do terrible things and people go hungry. What kind of God is this, right?
Yeah, it's, an interesting couple of terms that we could use. They're a little weird, so you may not want to actually use them. Don't put them on a t-shirt. There's 2 kinds of people in the world, normalists and abnormalists. Atheists are normalists. They believe that the world that we see right now is normal. This is the way it always has been and the way it always will be. Some of them have enough confidence that they think we can change it in the future, but they think the way we see the world is normal. Christians are abnormalists. We believe that the world is abnormal, that it is not normed or ordered the way God intended. And this helps us to make sense of the fact that good and bad exist alongside of one another.
You talked about these different spheres in art, in education, in church, and family. And one of your areas of expertise is public policy, public life. And so that's oftentimes politics, the state, that kind of thing. And it's its own sphere. It seems like in today's world, everything is politics. That it is not its own sphere, that it has inundated just about everything, and every conversation we have has something to do with politics. Do you think that's true?
I do think it's true. And one of the things that's happened, so let's first define the terms government and politics for those of you out there in podcast land. So what is the purpose of government in God's design? So as I see it, we would have some sort of, governing order, whether or not there was a fall. We wouldn't have military, we wouldn't have police, there'd be no evil, but we'd have to have a way of arranging our life, right? We'd have to decide which side of the road to drive on, who's going to bring the pumpkin pie to the fall festival, when are we going to hold the fall festival? There would have to be a way of organizing our lives. But now because of the fall, government takes on an entirely different hue. And instead of just helping to organize some things, it's supposed to achieve justice for the various individuals and communities under its purview. And so that means that there's injustice. If it's supposed to achieve justice, that's because injustice exists in the world. So what is politics? Well, politics can be described as the art and science of persuading other citizens and elected officials about how best to achieve justice for the various individuals and communities under its purview. And that's what politics is. Well, this sphere of government and politics, unfortunately, has swollen to gigantic proportions, like a giant octopus reaching its tentacles into every other sphere of culture. We talked a moment ago about each sphere having its own center and its own circumference. So government and politics has its own center, its own unique reason for being, which is to achieve justice, and therefore also has its own circumference. You can draw a circle around that center, and our political dimension of ourself isn't meant to control the other spheres or to do things that it wasn't intended to do. Unfortunately, I think what's happened in the West is most Americans have given up any real hope that it's God who does the saving of the world, and they've turned their attention to a salvation that will come right now. And the only way they can think to bring that is through government force and political power. And so everything's been politicized. And so we want to realize that politics is limited in what it can do, what it should do, and what it can do. And so we want to be careful to let politics do what it can do, and then realize that if we want to see God's will done in this earth, it'll never be done perfectly till Christ returns, number one. And number two, it'll have to be through all the spheres and not just through the political.
Everything's becoming politicized. Art, education, you can't get away from it, especially with social media, the internet age. I definitely want to hear some insights from you on this. How should we as Christians be engaging with these political issues differently than what's being modeled for us by the culture? So how can we engage from them differently than CNN does, or Fox News does, or Donald Trump does, or Joe Biden does?
Yeah, so first I want to give a little context before I answer the question directly about how to engage differently. One of the problems is a philosopher named Charles Taylor. Turns out he's not the same guy that made the shoes, the Chuck Taylors. I was so disappointed. I thought world-class philosopher and shoe designer, but turns out different guy. But Charles Taylor argued that most people in the West live life within the immanent frame. Now, this is a fancy phrase, immanent frame. Philosophers and sociologists have to invent vocabulary words to show people how important they are. Kind of say that lightly, but what he means by that, the word immanent, there are three words in the English language, all pronounced immanent, but I'm talking about immanent, and this is the opposite of transcendent. He argues that most Westerners live within what he calls the immanent frame. In other words, they have taken the idea of a transcendent God who they can rely upon and just put him on the shelf or thrown it away completely. And that they live within the immanent frame, within the world that we can see right now, without living life, without managing life, without any real reference to God. And he said even the most religious people who use God words all the time tend to live within the immanent frame. We don't need God when we're sick because we have medicine. We don't need God, for comfort because we have comfortable houses already. And so we just kind of read God out of things. And he says the problem is when we do that, we really have gotten rid of the transcendent moral framework that has governed our societies. And in the past, when we argued with each other politically, socially, and culturally, we were arguing toward the same transcendent frame of reference. Everyone kind of believed the same right and wrong, kind of based around the 10 Commandments, that kind of thing. And so we could have arguments and then go home and still be friends with each other. But now what's happened is that frame of reference has been jettisoned. Many people have jettisoned it explicitly and don't believe that there's any transcendent frame of reference. And so now what happens is people don't have any shared point of reference morally. And so we think the worst of each other and we just shout each other down. People gravitate toward their own tribe, type of people who think like them, tend to assume that everyone else is manifestly wrong and evil. And so we end up just shouting each other down.
I've never seen that, though. I've never seen anybody yell, shout each other down. It's, I don't know what world you're living in.
Never seen that on your Facebook wall. Nope. Never seen that on CNN and Fox. Yeah, you're right. So I think that's the context. We have people with very strong opinions about the way things should be, many of whom want revolutions. They see injustice around us. They see things that are wrong. They don't think God's going to fix it in the end and that we better fix it now. And they think that human beings are smart enough and good-willed enough to come up with a utopia of some sort and fix things in the here and now. And you have different sort of utopias that are imagined on different parts of the political spectrum. So how can we do better? I would give 4 principles, I think, that come to mind at the moment. One is we need to find creative ways of reintroducing God to the public imagination. Some of them don't really imagine him at all. They've imagined him out of existence. So we need to find creative ways of reintroducing God as the one who wants us to flourish, as the one whose moral order is what causes us to flourish. And there's some different ways we can do that. One is to make clear that the Bible's narrative of the world is the true story of the whole world. Fox's narrative is not the true story of the whole world. Sad to tell you. MSNBC's narrative, not the true story of the whole world. So grieved to have to tell you. But it's the Bible's narrative of the world. And we ought to constantly be referring to that narrative in appropriate ways and showing the beauty of it, finding ways of showing people that it's appealing. Another way of reintroducing God is to search out the false gods that people worship. Now, false gods are always good things that God created. Satan doesn't have his own material. There's nothing that he created. He has to use God's material and tempt us to elevate something like sex or money or power to the position that God alone should have. And we need to be able to find creative ways of showing people that when any of those things are elevated, whether it's material equality, socialism, an ethnic group within the nation, ethno-nationalism, or whatever, that those false gods they're counterfeit gods and they're false saviors. And only the true living God can order the world rightly. A third way, still under the first principle, to reintroduce God to the public imagination is to just make clear that our allegiance is to Christ more than it is to a preferred political leader or a preferred platform or preferred party. So that's one thing we can do that I think doesn't happen very often with Christians. There's too much of a slavish adherence to whoever is the most popular current political leader and that sort of thing. So reintroduce God, recenter him. Number 2, decenter ourselves. Now, it's very difficult for God to be at the center if we've placed ourselves at the center. So we've got to decenter ourselves. One way of decentering the self is to make sure that when we engage in social, cultural, or political discussions, that it's clear that we're seeking the good of the whole nation or the whole society and not merely our own tribe. That when we argue, based upon Christian principles, that these principles are what's good for everybody. A second way of decentering the self is to not set forth our beliefs in ways that are odious, to be civil. It doesn't matter which political leader that's ascendant, that's rude and abrasive and jarring. It doesn't matter. I mean, honestly, you should ignore almost all political talk show hosts and the demeanor of most politicians and we should carve out our own path. We should combine truth and grace the way Jesus did. Truth, I mean, speaking the truth about reality, what we believe is correct. And by grace, I mean having the humble demeanor of somebody who's been changed by the cross. And when you have a humble demeanor, you don't demean and degrade other people. You don't scream at them. You don't think the worst of them. And so truth without grace makes us political bullies and jerks. Grace without truth makes us political wimps and non-entities. So we want to reintroduce God, recenter him. We want to decenter the self. Third, I think we want to reframe issues. Sometimes it's helpful, often our approach on a given solution politically or a given issue, we're too slavish in just mimicking what is said by our favorite 8 o'clock in the evening or 9 o'clock in the evening political commentator, or 3 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever.
Right.
But as believers, we have different premises than a lot of other people and different forms of reasoning and sometimes different conclusions. Even if we come to the same conclusion as people in our own party, that doesn't mean that we have to reason in the same manner or with the same tone. We can, carve out our own path. So reframe issues. And then fourth, finally, is revitalize cultural institutions. Now, when I say that, people's eyes get big and like, isn't that a little bit of a tall task? Ashford, revitalize a cultural institution. I'm just trying to pay my bills. But you know what? Let me just mention 2 cultural institutions that everyone can revitalize. First is marriage and family. And if we work on being good fathers, good husbands, good brothers, good sisters, good grandparents, good children, that we can revitalize that. And that's the most basic institution of any nation, is the family. A second one I'd mention is, religious institutions, churches, that we can be meaningful members of a church, meaningfully involved, really significantly contributing to the good of that institution. So we can just start there. With other institutions that are bigger, we'll play a very small role, probably. Most of us are not like dominant figures who can single-handedly really move the needle. But we can, together, if all Christians are doing this work, we can actually begin to revitalize other cultural institutions. That's an attempt, a long-winded attempt. You have to excuse me. I was a professor and now I work for a think tank. So, long-winded is who I am. But there's an attempt to answer.
You got to live into who you are. That's good. We appreciate that.
I like to honor my personality flaws. Without them, I don't think I would have a personality at all.
Well, it seems like many of us, we're looking for models for this. And so what struck me about one of the things you said was we are mimicking our favorite cable news talking head or our favorite preacher or we are always looking for someone to model ourselves after. And it's just so frustrating when you hear a Christian speaking just like a cable news talking head instead of like Jesus.
Yeah, I got a couple of thoughts about talking heads. I have a lot of thoughts, actually. We'll limit it to 2. One humorous graduate game exercise, or I would say family exercise, would be to watch political commentators' careers and watch what happens. I promise you, not with all of them, but with most of them, guys on TV and radio who are making enormous amounts of money, millions and millions of dollars. Watch how quickly they change their convictions as soon as there's a new trend or a new political leader that's the darling. They will change 50% of their convictions within 4 years. And they will speak with the deepest conviction on a platform that's 50% different than the last president from the same party had. It's either humorous or it might make you distraught. I try to laugh a little bit instead of being so distraught. So just realize
not only that, but they will make the same arguments against the political party that they're opposed to. They'll make those same terrible arguments against them, and then they'll turn those same exact arguments into positives when they're talking about their political party. It's like the hypocrisy is just astounding sometimes.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A second thing that I would say about news outlets and so forth is that they are very aware that there are 3 human emotions that motivate human beings. Motivate them to watch a political talk show, listen to a political radio show, or click on an article. And those are anger, fear, and lust. I was a journalism major. I've worked for news outlets. And so any given article, they're looking for an anger angle, a fear angle, or a lust angle. And it's very cynical, and it's a way of making money. And so our news outlets are pouring gasoline on the fire of social unrest because they make money off of it. And we're generally duped by that.
Big time.
A third thing we could say is that it's best, if you want to be a level-headed person, it's best to get your news from a variety of sources and your opinion from a variety of sources. Now, these days, news and opinion have basically merged. The news is not just a stating of the facts. It's always got interpretive twists. Let me teach you a few of the tricks that you'll miss. Here's the most important trick. It used to be that journalists, when they were reporting the news, had to use relatively neutral verbs. Because when you use really specific verbs, it does interpretation work. And they wanted to leave the interpretation to the audience. So they would say, candidate so-and-so said, and they would quote what they said. Well, what happens now, instead of the word said, they would say, political candidate so-and-so said furiously that such and such, or so-and-so cynically said this, or they add adverbs, or they change the verbs. So-and-so condescended. I mean, this is not good news practice. And so even the news, just in the way verbs are used, purposefully is used to take the focus off of facts and give an interpretation of the facts. So just realize that and know it. Get your news from a variety of sources on any given topic. Get stuff from both the right and the left. I mean, I fall on the left, on the right in the political spectrum, not the left. And yet I read articles on the left and on the right. And left and right is a really bad bias. I mean, it's not entirely helpful. You got 6 major political ideologies that exist right now, and that's the more helpful way of understanding what's happened politically than trying to divide everyone into two camps.
Right.
But for some reason, especially among evangelical Christians in today's political sphere, you see this knee-jerk negative reaction against anything that's labeled social justice. You know, anything as far as immigration, overcoming racial inequality. There's almost like an instant resistance when you bring those things up to a lot of evangelical Christians, as to where it seems like they're rejecting them on basis of political ideology. But, you know, are those things inherently political? How can Christians hold fast to the gospel of lordship of Jesus Christ and continue to be active in seeking justice? Can you be faithful to your Christian ideology and still seek those things? Because I think a lot of Christians think you can't.
Yeah, so let's just, first of all, let's define terms for a moment. So I would say that all justice is social. So I don't usually use the phrase social justice, but it is a popular phrase today, so we can use it. All justice is social. And so there's no distinction. I think one of the things that's happened is that the phrase social justice, even though it was coined by a conservative, is generally a phrase used by the left and usually signals the sort of widespread change and often that conservatives tend to not like. So how do we unite at all? Some of the things that fall under what is often called social justice, that I would just call justice, we'll say immigration. No matter where you land on the spectrum of how many people it's wise for us to appropriate and bring into our borders, some people think that we can have massive numbers of folks and that and they view the positives of those numbers. It can boost the economy in some ways and it can create cultural diversity that will be helpful. And so if you want a larger number of immigrants, or if you're somebody who thinks that we should assimilate and accommodate a smaller number so that we can maintain a sort of cultural equilibrium. Wherever you stand on that as a believer, we can disagree on solutions. How many people should we have? How many should we not? What we cannot disagree on is that every human being should be treated with dignity because they're created in the image and likeness of God. So a progressive might argue, I think the people who have come here who are undocumented are on the whole good people and they work hard. And they came here for a better way of life. Let's give them amnesty. Let's forgive it. Conservative, who's equally good-willed, says, and I'm assuming goodwill both times, right? There's a lot of bad-willed people, but I'm assuming goodwill on both sides with this discussion. Conservative comes along and says, yeah, you're right. These are mostly good people, and they came here because they were desperate. But if we just give amnesty and just what we're saying is, people have always believed a law is not a law if it's not enforced. And if we just get rid of it, we might as well not even have a law. And so, a goodwill conservative would say, okay, if somebody's here and they're undocumented and they're not a felon and, they meet certain standards, let's let them stay with a temporary card and let you get in the back of the line for citizenship. So the people who did this lawfully don't get cut in line. And in both of those instances, you have goodwill people treating immigrants with dignity and yet disagreeing on how many should come into our country and what should we do with people who are already here and undocumented. The problem is that there's a lot of bad-willed people. People use demeaning and degrading language about immigrants. On the one side, there's their leaders on the right. I think President Trump's language was very, very disappointing, to put it lightly. The way he talked about Mexicans as murderers and rapists. I don't think there's any higher percentage of murderers and rapists among Mexicans as there are among Americans. And on the left, you've got, people ascribing the worst of intentions to people on the right. So you got bad-willed people everywhere. And what we're going to have to do as Christians is to model a better way, not get caught up in the moment and act and interact and speak with the same kind of low level of character that many of our fellow citizens do. Yeah, we're going to have to find new ways of persuading. I think we're going to have to, as believers, we're going to have to really get into the mindset and the feel of what it is like to be someone who's not a Christian in America or not culturally American in America. Empathy. That takes a hard work, actually. It means spending time with people. It means thinking through the implications of things and then figuring out how to win people over.
Well, and I think it's 70 years ago, Christianity was still the widely accepted moral framework in this country. Shifts were happening, but for your average person, that was still widely the norm. Even if you weren't practicing, there was a pretty shared culture there. And at this point, that is not the case, and it is rapidly becoming less and less of the case. So Christians have to think differently. You can't assume a shared framework anymore. I work with high schoolers and college students, and I was just at a retreat this weekend, and that's what I was hammering in for some 16-year-olds. I was like, guys, if you want to be a Christian in your lifetime, it is going to be even different than it is now. And you have to be ready for that. You have to be ready that the world is different. You're going to have to really live your gospel differently and more intentionally than I think Christians have had to in a very long time.
Yeah, the early church distinguished between dissuasoria and persuasoria, with dissuasoria being defending the Christian faith by making arguments against bad arguments and a firm and vigorous defense of what we believe. And they called that dissuasoria is the way of the closed fist. Persuasoria is the way of the open hand. And that is entering into another person's mindset, understanding the way they experience the world and persuading, winning them over. It's the lost art of Christian persuasion. That's what we've got to regain.
Thanks for coming on the podcast, Bruce. We really appreciate your insights.
Thank you. It's great being on the show.
I appreciate your time, Bruce. Thank you.